So I'm about 4 days into this painting, and I am finally adding some color to my lemon. This lemon is mostly in shadow, so I'm just going to start out with this lemon yellow on this side, but I'm going to quickly go into a shadow color. When I'm using yellow, it is really easy to muddy up yellow. So I started with my pure yellow first, and then added the shadows into it to blend. Of course, before I start, I have all of my colors mixed on my palette, and I have wet my paper, so I'm doing this as a wet into wet wash. But everything is mixed and ready before I start this next step for sure, so that I can blend it all at once right onto the wet paper, adding all those different colors in. If I have to stop and mix color in the middle, my paper would start to dry and I would never get that nice even wash that I'm going for. Keeping in mind I don't have to get every single piece in the first wash, but it sure is a lot easier if you can. You want to make sure you keep that round feel, so the bottom will be darker where the light's not hitting it as much. And we'll put that wash in and let it dry. Putting the wash in on my second lemon. Avoiding where my main highlight is. When you're putting a color in, you want to make sure you know the properties of the color you're using. And I do know that this yellow lifts easily. So if I get it a little bit over where my shadow is, I don't have to worry too much because I can lift it. Not all yellows you can, so you just want to make sure you know the properties of the color that you're using before you start. Because not everything can be lifted easily. And again, this was a wet into wet wash, so I had wet the paper first. I had all the colors pre-mixed and ready to go and wet on my palette, so that when I'm putting these colors in, I don't have to pause and mix color or wet the paper. Everything can just flow right into each other while I'm going. I have found one of the most important parts of watercolor painting is making sure everything is prepped and ready when you start. We've got basically all of that in. More will have to go in future washes, of course. But you want to get as much as you can in this first wash because it does flow so easily together. Adding in some more color on my lemons. Avoiding the highlight area completely. This is a great color. It's imidazolone yellow. Imidazolone lemon yellow. And it does lift very easily, so you don't have to worry as much as you normally would necessarily, because you do know that it will lift, but you still don't want to go over where you want that white paper. It's always nice to plan ahead a little and leave that yellow. Leave that not yellow, sorry, so that it'll clean right up. I always try not to use masking on paintings because I don't like how it changes the surface of the paper. And because of the dark background and the light lemons, I did use masking on this. Sometimes it seems to seep into the edges a little bit more. I'm not a big fan. I always try to not use masking because it does just mess up the paper. Sometimes it's necessary, unfortunately. So this is just obviously the first wash of yellow. I will come and put much more detail in once this is dry with future washes, but it's nice to get the base colors in the beginning all in one wash. And of course it's a wet into wet wash. I wet the whole area first to make sure that it doesn't flow into other areas. And before I start, I always have my paint mixed up, ready to go on my palette, so that I'm not mixing while my paper is drying. Everything is already mixed up and wet and ready to go on my palette before I wet the area on my paper, so that once I start, I can just start adding that color right in. And you can see I went over this area right here, which I didn't want to do. Of course, that happens with everything. But knowing that I can lift this, and that that's also going to be a yellow lemon, it's something that I'll just work out later, lift out later, once my lemon has dried. It is not something I will mess with while the paint is still wet, because I know that will just end up screwing it up further. So I'll just leave that little spot and clean it up once everything is dry. And again, this is just the first wash, so I will be adding in more detail, more future washes, darker colors, things like that as I go. Just to get that initial idea of the lemon in. The darks where I want them, knowing that I will darken them later. There we go. Adding my yellow in, my imazidazolone yellow. And making sure I'm avoiding any highlights still. And keeping in mind what areas are shaded. I am having some runoff into my edges, and I think that's because masking just screws up that paper surface. I use Arches 300-pound cold press bright white. It's my current paper of choice, which I love. It has a fantastic surface, but wherever I've put masking on it really kind of screws it up. So you want to keep that in mind while you're painting so that you can watch those edges where you've put masking and make sure that the paper's not too rough or it's not going places where you don't want it to. So the lemon color is the imazidazolone lemon, and my darker, brighter yellow here is Gamboge Nova, both Holbein colors. And then I'm using the black mixture that I'm using for this painting to darken them for these shadow colors. A little bit of burnt sienna mixed in there so it doesn't get too green. And of course, I'm not worrying about the imperfections in the lemon skin and things like that. All that stuff and tiny little details I will add after the fact. Once this first wash dries, I will go through and add all those little details and the subtle shadows that are within it, things like that. I'm just not worrying about that now in this initial wash. I'm starting to put a couple light washes on the inside of my cut lemon, making sure to keep these super light, especially to start, and avoiding the areas, the little in-between pulp areas. Just like the other parts of the lemon, this will just be the first wash in these areas. You want to keep in mind you can always go and darken something, but it's a lot harder to lift. So you don't want to go too dark to start. And you're going to have some areas that you want to leave those light highlights. So by putting just the light wash in first, it will be much easier to keep the areas as highlights that I want to. You'll notice that you can barely see my lines, and that is on purpose because I knew that when I'm painting, everything in this part is basically yellow and white, which is just the paper. So if I had dark lines, you would see them. So if I'm drawing something and I know that it's going to be a dark shadow or the edge of a dark object, you don't have to worry quite as much about how dark your drawing is. But if you're painting a white flower or a lemon or something like that, you definitely want to make sure that your guidelines are super, super light. I almost put them in and then erase them after I've drawn it, just to make sure that it is super light, because I don't want to have a yellow lemon and then see a whole bunch of guidelines on the edges of everything. There will be some darker areas, but a lot of times you can't lift those lines later, so you want to make sure that they are super light if you're painting a light colored object, especially on a flower or something like that. You don't want lines at the edges of each of your petals. But a lemon is very similar. Putting in these last couple little sections. And again, keeping it all super light so that my highlights will be really easy to keep later. If I put in a dark yellow wash, it would be much harder to go in and have those highlights stand out later on. So I'll have some change in color, but most of it I will put on as details later. I'm putting the washes in on this other lemon, because this one has a lot more light reflecting off of it than the other one did. Instead of starting with super light washes, I'm making sure to preserve the white of the paper where those reflections are. So I'm actually starting with a slightly darker wash of color and just avoiding the spaces where that light is reflecting off the certain little pieces of lemon in there. So this one has a lot more highlights in it, so instead of putting that initial wash over everything, I'm leaving those highlights right from the beginning by just painting around them in that first wash. And I'm changing up my colors as I go, because this one has the nice effect of the deepening shadow from the other lemon slice that's leaning right on it. So instead of that first all over wash, I'm doing this one a little bit different than the other one. And adding in that color just a little bit differently. So I'm again using my imazidazolone, I still don't know how to pronounce it, yellow, on this part of the lemon. And then I'm using Gamboge Nova, where the shadows are getting deeper. That's that deeper yellow. I'm also using Raw Sienna, where the shadows are really deep in this area, from that other lemon. And then I'm using the black mixture that I have used throughout the rest of the painting to darken those colors. It's not really a black mixture. You can make it black. I'm not making it that dark. I'm using it more of a gray mixture. That's what I used on the background. And that is in Danthrin Blue, the same Gamboge Nova, and Quinacridone Red, which is my new go-to favorite color. I change them up all the time. Oh, there's the phone. So I'll darken up some of these inside areas where that shadow is. Because on this lemon, where my white is in the center isn't white at all because of that shadow. It actually has the yellow reflection from the lemon. You want to make sure you make those shadows bright and interesting. You don't want to just have a grayed out dull shadow, because really it's a shadow, but it's also the lemon above, the light coming through and reflecting. So you wouldn't just make it darker, you also want to make sure it's more intense. This lemon slice is at a different angle, and it has the sun, not the sun, my light hitting it a lot stronger. So it's a much lighter color than the others. And because of the angle, it does not have as much bright reflections on part of it. It does have some coming up here, so I'll leave some of this white for the highlight. The color gets a little deeper towards the top. And as it's traveling over towards this side, it's getting a little bit brighter, more yellow, because it has the shadow and reflection through that top lemon. So this bottom area will be much deeper because of that reflection. I have the first wash on this already. So now I'm going to start going in and adding a little bit more color and depth to it while making sure to preserve some of those highlighted areas. This is a much slower process than the first wash, because I'm making sure I'm avoiding any of the areas that have the reflection and And I'm definitely going to be doing this in multiple washes. So I'm in no rush to get it all on there. This is why paintings like this take so long. And this, I love this part of the painting because I can just sit, kind of get lost in my own mind. If I'm not taping, I usually have some good music playing and can just add all these tiny little details. Sometimes I get a little bit too into it and I have to remind myself that nobody is going to look this close and I don't need to go too crazy. But I enjoy this part of it, adding all these tiny details and building up the layers, and all of a sudden your flat piece of paper seems to come alive. That's my favorite part. Even though I take so many reference photos of things, I always have slightly different view in my mind of what the finished product is going to look like. So I see my reference photo that I'm going by, but in my mind I have a different way that I feel like it's going to come out. And I like seeing that take shape as I'm going. So you can see I'm just going slow through it, using all my different yellows as I go, and adding in these little details. I'm adding some of the little detail to the edge of my lemon. If you cut a lemon open, it has all these almost little pockets, little dots along the edge. So I have my outer edge in, and then I'm adding a bunch of these little pockets. Now once this dries, I will put a unifying wash over it to kind of blend them together a little bit, because I don't want them to be quite exact little dots everywhere. You want to make sure to vary them a little bit. You don't want them all the same. And to vary the color as you go around, just like the outer edge varies. To add all that little detail in.